Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Teeth Matter. I'm your host, Ellie Halabian, DDS, and this episode is with Stephen O. Stephen has 16 years of experience in the dental industry, and he joins the podcast to share his expertise as a transition advisor at Aprio. Aprio specializes in dental CPA services, accounting, tax, wealth management, and practice transitions, which makes Stephen an invaluable resource for navigating the complexities of buying, selling, or starting a dental practice. In this episode, Stephen dives into key topics, including navigating current dental market trends, timing the purchase or sale of a practice for maximum benefit, essential considerations for a successful sale, understanding valuation methodologies, and so much more. So whether you're a dentist considering a transition, exploring a startup, or simply wanting to stay ahead in the evolving dental industry, this episode offers practical advice and actionable takeaways. Let's dive in. Hey there. By now you should know that the Teeth Matter podcast is a no-judgment zone for real conversations about life in dentistry. We break down the highs, the lows, and the truths to help each other level up, both personally and professionally. That's why I want to talk to you about something that can not only boost your income, but also support your patients on their oral health journey, especially those looking for fluoride-free options. First off, have you heard about Methodology? It's the new fluoride-free toothpaste brand that uses 10% nanohydroxyapatite and xylitol. And if I had to describe them in 2 words, I'd say clean and effective. Now here's a scoop. Teeth Matter has partnered with Methodology to give you exclusive access to their ambassador program. So if you're a dentist, a dental hygienist, or even a dental student, this is your opportunity to make an impact and earn $10 for every person who tries their toothpaste using your very own link. Mouthology is the perfect option for patients looking for a more holistic yet super effective oral care product. And by joining, you're not just sharing a toothpaste, you're stepping into a movement that's redefining how we care for our mouths. Clean, effective, game-changing. So what are you waiting for? Hit that link in the show notes, sign up, and start sharing Mouthology today. Be sure to tell them that Teeth Matter sent you. Stephen, I'm so excited to have you on Teeth Matter. You are the perfect resource for this conversation because recently I've been chatting with a few friends and I've had audiences from the community reach out asking about next steps in their career. Everyone's an associate. They want to take the next step, maybe become a practice owner, but they don't have the information, the resources, or don't even know the jargon when it comes to buying a dental practice. And I think you are the best person to ask these questions. So if you're ready, we're going to just dive into it. Okay.
Let's do it.
My first question for you is, what are some trends in the dental market practice?
I think right now the trend has been and continues to be that there's probably not enough people selling offices in general. And so I think that's led a lot of young people to look to start up simply because the amount of dentists retiring is not commensurate with the amount that are actually coming in. I think that's number one. We're seeing a little bit of slowdown in private equity because rates have gone up a little bit, and that affects, how many practices they can buy in general. And the amount that they're able to offer. And really, there's very few practices that are sizable enough for a lot of private equity to actually go after. And so I think the trend in dentistry is we're still seeing quite a few build outs. The last 2 or 3 years in particular, we saw a huge spike in the number of just startups from 2020, 21, 22 into 23. It's come down a little bit in 24. I think that's probably a byproduct in election year. For whatever reason, we tend to see that people get a little bit skittish around any political season for whatever reason, and it happens every 4 years, and we see it pretty consistently.
And do you find that there are certain regions or maybe certain types of practices that are a little bit more in demand?
The sweet spot for most associates that are looking to buy, the vast majority want to buy right around $1 million. And I think that has to do with the fact that most doctors think, hey, I can produce, anywhere from 50 to 70,000 on a monthly basis. 3 to 400,000 of that practice can be hygiene. And usually at about that $1 million mark, we typically see that the cash flow is a little bit better, meaning, as an example, if you have $1 million office and the overhead is about 65%, it means that as an owner, you could possibly take home 350, 400, 450, which is more than people are making as associates, right? I think the average associate in North America makes 190, 180, 200, depending how many offices you work at, how many days you work, your location, are you major metro, are you rural? The rural practices, people tend to get paid a little bit more. The city practices, people tend to make a little bit less just because of density and the amount of saturation in those markets.
When it comes to buying or selling a practice, what's the right time?
It's funny. I don't know that there's a right time. I think very few people regret buying early, meaning like the sooner you buy, the longer the ROI. Just from a math standpoint, meaning if owning a practice means at the end of your career, you can make 600,000 a year or 500,000 or whatever the number you want it to be conservatively, right? And let's say that number is 400,000, but as an associate, you're making 150. Then it just becomes a math problem, right? If at the end of your career, you spend 5 years making 150 versus, 5 more years at 400, you could calculate whatever that differential is. You wait 5 years, it might cost you 1.25 million in opportunity cost. I think the hard part that is the intangible of all of this, and to be completely honest and clear about this, owning your own business is scary. It's not for the faint of heart, but it's like anything else. I think it's a worthwhile pursuit. And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway I can give. Like, no one's really ready. It's a labor of love, and it takes time to cultivate the ability to run a business. The reality is, clinical dentistry is consistent, meaning you walk in a dental practice that's producing $1 million, an MOD is an MOD, a crown's a crown, an inlay is an inlay. That part of your day-to-day doesn't change. It's everything else. It's the HR, it's the OSHA, it's the employment law. It's all the stuff that no university will ever prepare you for, right? And no book, no podcast you can read will prepare you for every single little thing, right? I had someone today that, we closed on a practice, and one of the biggest things was like switching over internet to her name and negotiating the internet rates. And it's all these small little things that we see that kind of get people stuck, or that it's almost like death by 1,000 cuts. But once you figure that part out, it's fine. It takes time. As far as when's a good time to sell, my opinion is it depends what you want, right? I think financially, you prepare to retire as early as you can financially. And if you love dentistry and you're passionate about it, like, work until you're 90. I don't care, right? In fact, there's a doctor that I knew who sold his practice at 97. I mean, that's how much he loved dentistry.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a true story. And the guy was the oldest Holocaust survivor in North America. It was amazing. But the guy kept practicing, not because he needed the money, not because he just loved dentistry. He was so passionate about it. And I think we all think we're going to work forever. We're all invincible until we're not, right? And so I would say, plan to retire early, but if you love it, keep going. When you sell, I think when you know you're going to slow down, or that you can't do it anymore. I'll tell you, the number one reason that people typically sell, even if they're able to work, is just burnout. I mean, it's constant, right? We live in a different world. It's constant. It's digitized. It's Yelp reviews. It's all that stuff.
That's an interesting point. Would you recommend somebody maybe negotiating their sales terms in a sense that, like, maybe they keep some equity in the business or bring on a partner, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I think it's really hard. Most dental practices, there's not enough volume to support 2 doctors. Most practices are just enough volume to support 1 doctor, meaning the cash that the the profit that the practice throws off is typically only enough to support one provider. And so if you have two doctors or a partnership, it becomes very difficult unless that practice is very large. If you have a $2 million practice, yeah, it can support two individual dentists. But if you have a practice doing $1 million, it cannot support three individual dentists, right? Because it's three lifestyles, it's three, I'm assuming all three have student loan debt, it's three sets of family. You always want to have a good relationship when you transition with the seller. A lot of times, if you can keep them on, it's usually good unless they stick around for too long. There's also that. But if they're productive and there's enough production for two people, it doesn't hurt. The only caveat is there needs to be enough volume. I also think it's risky to partner with a buyer that you don't really know. Like, partnerships are tough. They don't work for everyone, and there's personalities involved. And there's a saying, the only ships that don't sail are partnerships. I'm not totally against them, but I do genuinely think that you have to think long and hard about getting into it, because there's usually a dichotomy where perhaps one doctor feels like they're outproducing the other, and they created more value in the practice because one person places implants and the other doesn't, and that doctor outpaces the first doctor, and it can be difficult, I would say, to manage that relationship when it comes to cents and dollars.
Have you seen partnerships that work?
Absolutely. I mean, there's plenty of partnerships that work. I think typically you have to be really similar in clinical philosophy. I'll say that's number one, right? Your partner can't think you overdiagnose, you over-treatment plan, you're overtly aggressive. I also think personality-wise, you guys have to spell everything out. You have to put it out there in writing. And then you also need to put in writing, how do you deal with situations that you're not going to foresee that might come about, such as, what if someone has a baby and they need to relocate because home is 2,000 miles away, right? How do you split that equity? And I think clear line of communications, between two partners is probably, it's like any other relationship. You have to talk about it. Two, you have to have contingency plans in place, just in case, right? It's almost like getting married with a prenup, kind of like that, right? You assume everything's going to work out, but you just plan accordingly. And there's plenty of, you look at, Brian Valiwaz and Adam, they seem to be doing great. They're good guys, and those Ramsey and Murder in Florida, they're also very good guys, and they seem to be doing very well together. But I think you have to have that personality that meshes. You don't have to be identical, but it's something you have to talk about. It's not easy. I'll say a lot of times I tell friends, like, if they absolutely want to partner, I think it's usually good to have a home base for your first practice, meaning you both have your individual standalone practices, and perhaps you partner in a second one where you're both contributing 50% of your time to that second location, and it's a second location for two people. Again, it's tough. If you want to buy, it's very difficult to find a practice big enough, right? You have to find something that's 1.5 to 2 million to support the lifestyle of two doctors, two debt loads, right? Because collectively, if you want to go buy a practice with another doctor, assuming everyone has $500,000 of student loan debt, the practice needs to support $1 million essentially in student loan debt between two people. But two people have individual families, individual lifestyles, individual debts outside of student loans, perhaps.
So when someone is looking to sell their practice, how far in advance should they start preparing their practice for sale so that they can maximize its value?
That's a great question. I think you should look at least 5 years out, right? Meaning, I will say the hard part of being a dentist is that clinical takes a lot out of you, as you know, right? Like, you guys come home after an 8-hour day and you're wiped, like mentally, physically, right? You're sitting at dinner chewing on a steak, thinking about whether a tooth is going to go endo because it was hot when you touched it. You cemented it with GI just to hope it doesn't go endo, right? And so I say that because your capacity as an individual is limited, because you're trying to be a good clinician. You're trying to be a good business owner. You're trying to be a good parent, a good sister, a good brother, whatever it is. I think that the day-to-day is you should know your numbers and keep track of them, right? Too many people have no clue what goes on. And I mean that not because they're maliciously ignoring it. I think it's just a capacity issue. Like we're all people at the end of the day. And one of the true things about owning a business that's interesting is that when you run a profit and loss, P&L, the amount of items going out and coming in could be hundreds of line items a month. And so it's very hard to keep track of that and know what true profitability is. I tell you that because I've had offices where they've stocked up or overstocked and $50,000 of an implant going on sale and all the implants were expired, right? Stuff like that. And so I think one, you have to pay attention day to day. It's not about the end of the road. It's important to think that far ahead. I think you think, what's my 5-year plan? What's my 10-year plan? What's my 15-year plan? Meaning, again, burnout is kind of consistent, meaning, and it's at different phases of your career. You might think, hey, I want to sell at 60. And you might think, hey, I'm at this point in my career where I really like working. Maybe I'll go another 5 years. So I think you have to plan pretty far ahead. And just know that you're running a pretty good business and you're running a pretty good ship. And it's hard to, micromanage everything. And you don't want to do that because you can die of a stroke if you do that. But like you should know your numbers. I think you should plan 10, 15 years ahead of time. Know your numbers and know what a good practice looks like and understand the numbers, right? That's really it. It's, what's the saying? If you don't know where you're going, you're definitely going to get there.
I was going to ask you, based on your experience, like what are some maybe common loose ends where you can, tidy up to increase the value of your practice?
I think tightening up the personal expenses through the practice, I think that's probably number one. I think a lot of times people, the upside of having a business is that you have a vehicle where you can write off your personal expenses. That's fine. Mm-hmm. Nothing wrong with that. Everyone does it within reason, right? I think you have to kind of limit what you write off. I think if you're at the end of your career, you're probably older, right? Assuming, right? Not everyone retires young. Some people do. I think you try to utilize things that are easily what we call add backs in the industry, meaning we can say like a retirement account is a good example. If you shove, 69,000 in a profit share plan, and we say, well, that's not an actual expense source of practice. That's the doctor saving for retirement. It lowers your taxable income, right? But it also allows you to defer taxes as well. And it allows you to have a write-off to where you show less on paper so that you're hopefully in the lower marginal bracket. Instead of going to Costco and writing off your Costco runs or writing off gas or buying a G-Wagon for that matter, right? Don't buy a G-Wagon, people. Everyone wants a G-Wagon. And those of you who are listening, you know who I'm talking about.
When it comes to like valuation methodologies, what do you need to look at? Are they different for different types of practices?
Yeah, so it's really how different are they for the buyer, right? Meaning we look at cash flow methods, meaning I was just on the phone with a good friend in Texas who called me right before I hopped on here. If the true cash flow of the practice is really like, let's say a practice is $1 million, the overhead is actually 60%. Mm-hmm. Before you pay yourself, when everyone else is paid, like what would you take home? That's 400,000. That's essentially cash flow, really. It's mm-hmm. what you would take home personally as the business owner if you took all the distributions from the business, you didn't leave anything in the practice at the end of the year. That would be a doctor-to-doctor transaction, right? Okay. The other numbers that we look at is something called EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization. It's a buzzword. It's been going on forever. That is essentially the number that DSOs look at to value your practice, right? So if you have a larger practice, the EBITDA tends to be pretty big, and they use a multiple of that number to get to a certain valuation on your practice. And every DSO has kind of the formula, and it's slightly different across the board. So EBITDA is the second way we value it. You can also think of EBITDA. The easy way to kind of think about this is it's the doctor replacement cost. Meaning, if you had one practice, Ellie, and you bought my practice, but you're going to be an absentee owner, or you're just going to be a manager of the second location, but you're physically not in it, it means mm-hmm. how much would I have to pay another associate? And if I paid that associate 30%, 28%, how much profit am I going to make at the end of the year in that practice? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you want me to go through like a mathematical, I'd probably bore your audience with numbers, but like if you want me to go through a mathematical example, I'm happy to.
Go through it. I'm
All
sure
right.
people would appreciate it.
So let's say you have a $1 million office, and let's hypothetically say the overhead's about 60%.
Yeah.
Let's assume that 700,000 of that practice, or 70% of that practice, is restorative dentistry from a provider, from a doctor provider, and the remaining 30% is hygiene driven, right?
Okay.
On that 70%, if I have to pay, as a simple illustration, if you have to pay me to be the associate at this practice, Ellie, and I command 30%. Okay, so it means on 700,000, you're going to pay me 210. The profit margin is 10% on that 700,000 because overhead 60%. So you're going to make 70,000 off of me as an associate. Then on the hygiene side, you're going to make, 40% of the 300,000. That's 120. So your EBITDA, or your profit, will be 190,000, right? That assumes you're buying cash. That assumes you have no debt. There's a lot of assumptions here, but for simple illustration, essentially it's like, well, if you had to pay a full-time doctor there, how much money would you make as an individual is essentially what it is. And most DSOs use that model because they're not doctors, they're corporations, right?
Does it differ between different types of practices? Like, would you recommend a certain specialty going with EBITDA, or if it's, I don't know, what we said, cash flow in the beginning?
I think it depends what you want to perpetuate, meaning some doctors, as an example, who would you sell to and why? When you bring up the DSO thing, there's this whole moral dilemma almost surrounding it, right? Some people will say, well, I don't want to sell to DSO because they assume that DSO perpetuates whatever type of dentistry, which is not necessarily true. And so it depends what you want to do.
What do you mean?
I think some people think that the DSOs might be aggressive and they might want to try to treatment plan and diagnose and grow the practice. And so they feel like, I don't want to sell to someone that's going to be aggressive for my patient base. The number one reason I'll tell you people sell and what they think about, it's almost continuity of care. That's the number one thing on the doctor's mind. Who's taking care of my patients? 2, continuity of staff. Who's taking care of my staff members who've helped me grow this business? Number 3 is the money, almost always in that order. Very seldom is it not in that order. And it depends who you talk to, right? Some people will say DSOs are terrible because of whatever. I don't believe that to be true because individual dentists work there. And so long as the dentists are good, then they perpetuate good work, right? Just in general. So to get back to the question, well, which valuation model is better? I think it depends where you're at. Meaning, as an example, early in my career, when I sold practices, they were typically for people in the mid 30s and 40s. So they still had to work, but they ran a business. It wasn't for them. They conquered them out and they wanted to move on to the next phase of their career. I think to that end, those people might be better suited to sell to DSO because they would sell and they would create a job for themselves, because DSOs require you to work back, right? You have to be there for several years following the sale of the business, right?
I did not know that.
Yeah, typically most DSOs will ask you to stay back for 5 to 7 years. So if you want to ensure continuity of your ability to still have income after you sell, right? Because, if a doctor sells at 45, they probably don't have enough money to retire. Not always true. They probably don't, right? You're still very young. And 2, like, what would you do all day, right? You can go sip a pina colada and sit on the beach, but all your friends are working, right? That will get old pretty soon. And so I think to that end, if you sell to a DSO, you create a job for yourself for at least 5 years. And that's appealing to some people, right? And because it's usually shared equity or a joint venture model where they buy out 60%, you sell in 40%, and then you progress to some point in time where you sell the remaining shares to them or your remaining ownership stake to them. So if you're mid-career, maybe a DSO makes sense simply because it could keep you employed. The thing with LA as an example, right? I'm in Los Angeles, you're in New York. If you sell a practice, non-competes are typically enforceable because you sold the business, there's monetary consideration. And when you think about that, in LA, it might be a 5 or 10 mile radius. Like, you might as well just move states in LA. 10 miles could be an hour, right? Same thing with New York, like 10 miles in Manhattan, like, good luck. You're in Jersey, right?
Yeah. Totally.
And so I think you have to, that has to be consideration unless you're relocating altogether. I think if you're at the end of your career, and again, depending on what you want to do, if you're 65 and you have no desire to work and your goal is to sell and go fishing, you can't sell a DSO because the value for the DSO is in you staying and transferring the goodwill. So your best bet is going to be selling to a private practitioner. So cash flow would make sense as a valuation method for DSOs. Again, EBITDA model would make a little bit more sense, right? And then there's things that are really hard to find. Like we do try to pull comps, sometimes comparables, but they're really difficult to find for dental practices. Not like a house where a house sells every 5 minutes. Dental practices are fewer and far between and harder to have a relative number simply because scope of dentistry might be very different. The insurance mix might be very different. The location will be very different, right? A practice in Manhattan is very different than one in New Jersey versus one in downtown New York. They're all very different demographic of patients.
So now when someone's looking to buy a practice, what are some red flags that they should look for when it comes to like finances or operations?
One, I think as a very general rule, if it's really difficult to understand the financials, it's probably a red flag. Meaning most banks typically don't like to loan to things that you have to comb through over and over again to really understand what the true revenue of the practice or the true profit of a practice is. I think that's a red flag, right? The other thing too is how much of what they're doing is recurring revenue and what's not, right? Meaning if it's a practice that does 40% all in X, you're not really going to capture all of that revenue later on. And do you, one, like as a practice clinically, like do you as a doctor do that scope of dentistry? And if you don't, it's tough. I'll say that, a lot of people compare buying a dental practice to buying a house. It's very different, right? The scope of dentistry needs to line up with what you're capable of and what you're comfortable and what you're competent in. It needs to be the insurance mix you want to take, right? Are they HMO? Are they PPO? Are they fee for service? Are they in-network fee for service, right? Are they out-of-network fee for service? Are they in-network with 20 insurances? Do you want an office that takes 5? Are they Delta Premier? What's the location? How many ops are they? What's the physicality of the office? Is it 2,000 square feet? Is it 1,000 square feet? Right? And a lot of people today want practices that are 5, 6, or 7 ops for the goal of future production. The reality is the cohort that was going out at this point, they hung their shingle 40 years ago, and their offices are 3, 4, 5 operatories. It's not to say it's impossible to find a 5 or 6, 7 operatory practice. It's just more rare because the previous generation, they opened up and they had 3, 4, 5 ops and they did just fine.
It's interesting that you say that. I never really thought about having the same type of practice. I thought maybe even if you buy a practice, you can eventually change the style of practice. So you could be, bread and butter dentistry, and then you turn it into cosmetic dental office.
Yeah, I think you can, right? I think the best way to think about this is whatever you bring should be additive, not subtractive. Meaning if you buy my practice and it's a $1.5 million office and I did 500,000 implants, you're paying the premium for the fact that it's a $1.5 million office, but you're going to lose $500,000 of recurring revenue if they've consistently done $500,000 a year in implants, right? So it probably doesn't make sense for you to buy that office simply because you're never really going to capture that volume unless you bring in specialty, right? You could always outsource. You could bring an associate in, bring a periodontist in to help you place implants. That's fine. But I think the scope needs to line up. And two, dentistry is funny and weird in that you guys like to do what you like to do, right? Like you might do a lower anterior endo, but you might not do an upper second molar endo, like, right? You don't want to do a distal composite on number 1, but you do a distal composite on number 8. Like, it's not fun.
Absolutely.
And so it depends, right? If there's a practice that you're capable of doing endo, doing a bunch, and you don't like to do it, should you buy the practice? The answer is maybe, right? Or if you want to suck it up and just do the endo, even if you don't like it, but you're capable and you're proficient at it, And I think that's the other thing. When you're buying a practice, you have to be proficient in whatever the scope of dentistry of the seller is, right? If they're
Okay.
really good at placing implants, if they're really good at, crown and bridge, and you walk in because you have an aesthetic eye and you have passion for veneers, that's an additive thing, right? That's great. Or if you love endo, there are doctors that love endo, a little sadistic. Just kidding. They, that's something you could add to the practice if they're referring out all endo, right? Likewise, if they're
Yeah.
referring out all the implant placements, and you can do that. I think the scope has to line up, right? And that's where the opportunity is, right? If they're not doing, if you buy $1 million practice, but they're literally a referrer dentist, they refer everything out,
Right.
then you can come in and you could really add value to the practice.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, you find the practice that matches the type of dentistry you want to do, the environment you want to create. Now you're buying this practice. How do you negotiate for a practice? How do you better your position?
I think you have to deal in facts, right? Meaning you have to deal in facts, and you have to understand where the numbers take you. As an example, there are practices in certain spaces where, let's say, you can't build, there's no inventory. I'll give you a good example. Venice, California, Venice Beach. You can't build a practice because you can't get permits. There's no parking. There's a parking issue where if you have X number of square footage, you have to have, and employees, you have to have X amount of parking spaces. But the problem with Venice is everything's public parking and no one owns the parking spaces. And so the question becomes, in a situation like that, you might have to overpay to be in that space because you can't even physically build out a practice, right? So there's less room for negotiation in a space like that. I think another way you should look at the numbers, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat. You should look at the numbers and ask yourself, if by going up 100,000 in price or coming down 100,000 in price, how does that affect the cash flow of the practice? So let's say you have to borrow an extra 50,000 to buy my practice, right? Or you want to pay $50,000 less. The question becomes, you're going to negotiate that, but does that actually affect the cash flow? I'm not saying the buy price doesn't matter, but it depends on where the market's at, how many people are looking at, what's your competition in the market, is someone else willing to pay whatever the ask price is, whether there's a valuation done or if it's purely a seller's asking price. I think you look at that and you say, if you borrow $50,000 more, it affects your cash flow by $500 or $600. It's not going to make or break $1 million practice, right? And so you can only negotiate on things like the cash flow's tight or it's overvalued, because I'll give you an example. If you have a $700,000 practice and the doctor's overhead is 90%, but they're asking for $700,000, like, yeah, go negotiate that, because that practice doesn't make sense, right? Once you borrow the debt, meaning you take out the loan, you're basically negative, that you're negative cash flow. So I would say the real good way to kind of think about this is probably long-winded, but surround yourself with a good team. Get a good CPA to look over your numbers, right? Have them run the numbers in a practice, run a cash flow, run what we call a customary cash flow for you. And what that basically means is, how much will you take home as a doctor if you buy this practice after debt service? Meaning, if you take out a loan for $700,000, the practice has 60% overhead, how much would you actually take home if you just maintain the practice, right? Then you could play with the numbers and say, what if you lost 20%? What if you gained 20%? And kind of make those adjustments on your own. But I would say find a good CPA to advise you and to help you look at the practices. There's a lot of good dental CPAs everywhere. I would talk to one and see if you can get someone to look at the numbers for you.
We're talking a lot about like buying and selling an existing practice. What if you're looking to just do a startup? What should you be looking for?
I think for startup, I'm a fan of startups, and it's simply because I've talked to a lot of people who come to me and they're looking to buy a practice, right? I deal with a lot of buyers. Mm-hmm. And I always ask a question like, hey, have you ever considered starting up? And it's simply because, again, there's not enough inventory. There's not enough people selling for the amount of people buying. And so I think, what's the upside to starting up? You can be wherever you want to be. It's your culture. You don't have to change anything. Physically can be as big as you want it to be. Aesthetically, it could be as pretty as you want it to be with the fit and finishes, that you can personally choose. And it's your baby. And so, and I'll get to the financial side of starting up versus buying. What's upside the buying? Well, you have immediate cash flow. You step in immediately. You can take over a practice that has goodwill. You're assuming some goodwill there if the seller helps you transition. I think there's upsides to both, and I think there's downsides to both. Meaning, as an example, if you want to be in Venice, you can't start up just physically. There's no space, and you won't get a permit for it. But you can buy a practice in Venice. Might not be what you want, but it's in location you want. Likewise, in LA, as a good example, or New York, there's pockets of spaces people want to be in. And basically someone needs to want to sell when you want to buy for that to work, right? And and if there's competition on the practice, it confounds the situation. I think that starting up makes sense a lot. If you're a pretty particular dentist, you've looked at a lot of practices and you spent a fair amount of time. I had a good buddy of mine who looked for several years, and I just one time was like, hey, why don't you start up? You seem so disheartened by everything you look at. You seem to be kind of unhappy with the inventory that's out there. And the reality is that's not in anyone's control, right?
Right.
I think you can keep waiting, but it just becomes a time thing. If you've been looking for 2 years, it might take you 2 years to start up. You can pursue both simultaneously, right? You can go look at practices and check out spaces all at the same time.
Sure.
And part of this is a discovery process. I think you have to step into this, and by doing some of it, you'll get a good idea of what you like or dislike. Meaning, if you look at practices, you might look at practices and think everything's old, everything's dated, they're paper charts, they're not digital X-rays, and by and large, the reality is the older practice, the doctors that are retiring and selling, their practices are not typically up to date. Why? Because you don't pay more money. The practice is not worth more if they have a cone beam. It's not worth more if they have brand new ADAC chairs, right? And a good analogy would be if I owned a house and I had a Sub-Zero fridge and a Viking range, like it doesn't increase the value of the house. It's cool. It's like putting rims on a car, like great. It doesn't mean the car is worth more. And so I think with a lot of practices, even if you buy it for $600,000, $700,000, $800,000, you end up putting a lot of money into it to make it your own, so to speak, right? Unless you get lucky. There are practices out there that are gorgeous, that are beautiful, that are selling, but they're usually not at retirement and they're 10 years old, but they're relocating, more rare.
How long does the discovery process usually take?
I think everyone's different, right? It depends how, this is more about intentionality and less about you looking. Because I'll talk to buyers, I've been looking for 3 years. Like, what does that mean? Like, are you intentionally looking? Or are you just like, this is Zillow for you and you're in bed scrolling, looking at and requesting prospectuses on practices, right? What I mean intentionally is like, do you go look at the practice physically yourself? Are you interviewing with the doctors who are selling, right? Are you going to tour spaces with real estate brokers to go look at spaces and potential? Are you talking with designers? I think if you're intentional about it, everyone's a little different, right? I'll say that usually the itch happens right around the 5 to 7 year mark. Why is that important? Usually at the 5-year mark, it's typically where doctors feel more confident in their clinical skill set. They've seen a fair amount of their own recalls and they think, gee, I've been doing this a while and I'm a pretty good associate. I'm a pretty good clinician. I think I could do this on my own. Like at a very basic level, your clinical ability needs to be very good, right? It needs to be good enough to where you can build a practice on top of your clinical skill. And that usually happens after 5 to 7 years. I think that's where most people gain the confidence once they start seeing their work come back and seeing patients request them by name at practices where their associates at.
Sure, that makes absolute sense. I think that's probably my philosophy. It's like I want to develop enough clinical skill and confidence so that when the business side is falling apart, I'm able to manage both at the same time.
Yeah. Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point, right? The 10,000 hour rule. That's about 5 years of intentional full-time work. And so I think it takes, like anything else, a fair amount of time to be proficient. And when you think about this, if you're buying a practice, right, there's always this kind of huge dichotomy. You have someone that's been practicing for 30 or 40 or 50, 60 years sometimes, and you have a new grad that's been out for 5. And so the dichotomy is 55 years, And so this is why you have to make sure you're proficient, right? Because someone that's been practicing that long has probably seen it all, right? They've seen everything, and you've seen a lot in your first 5 years, but probably not everything. Which is also why I'm a big fan of doing residencies and GPR programs, because you get exposed to a lot. And I'm also a big believer in you have to take CE, right? You have to take the continuing education to make you really good and proficient and understand, dentistry at a level that's beyond just anecdotal. Yeah.
I think you need to invest in yourself to have the confidence when it comes
100%.
to taking care of patients and treating patients, and also discussing like a treatment plan. It all stems from that. So if you mentioned, Steven, something earlier that it was the seller needs to support the buyer in the transition process. I never knew that. I never even expected that. So what can a buyer expect from the seller when it comes to?
Let me. You would want the seller to support the buyer. It does not always happen. Okay. And they're not required to by any means, because you're going to have a situation where maybe the seller has cancer and they can't support you. It's, these things happen. I think to that end, if you think you'll need the support, this is something you should discuss on the front end. You should meet with the buyer and say, hey, how long are you willing to stay? Right? People sell and retire for a lot of different reasons. I've had people who sell because they're relocating, right? They want to be with their daughter who just had their first grandbaby, and that's why they're hanging it up. So they might tell you, look, I only have 2 months with you. I had one doctor who called me. He's like, hey, can you sell my practice in 2 weeks? I was like, no, that's not that's not a reasonable request. Like, it takes the bank 2 weeks to get you an approval on this. And he literally goes, my wife told me, she bought me a plane ticket. I have to leave within 2 weeks. Otherwise, I'm just closing my practice. I would say you have to talk through this. Everyone's different. I've also had young doctors tell me, I was told by my brother who owns a practice that it's terrible when the seller stays on because the patients only want to see them. I don't know that that's necessarily true, right? And I think you have to play it by ear, and you have to see the type of relationship that doctor had with their patients, and use that to make your decision, right? If you feel like you need the support, talk with them through it. If it's a bread and butter practice, probably not. If it's more of a specialized practice where they did a lot of high-end treatment, you probably need a little bit more support from them.
2 last questions.
As many as
the first one, what is the best financial advice you've ever received?
It's corny and cheesy, but pay yourself first, probably. I think there's this dichotomy of I need to crush my debt and I need to save for the future. I think it's really, really important for everyone. You should understand taxes at a very basic level, right? That's just number one. Fundamentally, being an adult, being alive, making money, you have to understand taxes because doctors are typically in a higher tax bracket. So it would behoove you to understand the tax system. It's not that complicated. It's just insanely boring to 99% of people, right? Understand the tax system, and learn to save and invest consistently. I would say that's probably the biggest one. Too many people start too late. I've seen too many doctors have to work into their 70s because they were very poor at financial planning, right? Or they gave all their money to their kids, which that's very noble. But, the flip side of that is if you don't take care of yourself, your kids or your family will end up having to take care of you, right? Sure. And the difference is they have runway. They can figure it out because they're still young and they have time to figure out their financial life. You at a certain point do not as a doctor. I think the other thing I'll tell you is we talked about investing in yourself. Everyone will go take CE on how to do an MOD better. Nothing wrong with that. Okay. I appreciate people who want to be good clinically, but at a certain point, you're probably not getting a return on your investment. If you do an MOD, it's an inclusion, patient's not in pain, and you've been doing it consistently for a decade. You don't need to go take another class on how to restore an MOD better, right? What doctors don't do is probably take courses on how to be a better business owner, how to be a better business manager, right? And this is foreign for most in this because the focus is always clinical, clinical, clinical. I think it's really important to make sure that you could get out there and you take other courses, whether it's business, whether it's financial, right? Whether it's how to be a better leader, right? Because if the goal is to own a practice, right, it is a business first and it's clinical second. Meaning if you don't mind the business side and you don't pay your bills, you for very much longer won't have a practice. And it's rare, to be clear, almost everyone does fine. It's very rarely do we ever, if ever, see practices go out of business. It's usually, 3Ds. It's disability, it's drugs, it's divorce. It's usually nothing else. But I think you have to focus on developing a good business sense. And it's a developed skill. It's not like people are born and like, oh, that person's really good at business. Like, no, that person cultivated something and they became really good at running a business and talking to patients and managing staff, right? You'll go into a medical building in LA where there's 100 dentists. You'll knock on 50 doors and you'll talk to, 25 of them will tell you they're doing great. The other 25 will tell you the world's ending, right? And they're in the same building, they're the same location, they're the same zip code, they're probably about the same age. It's all up to you. I mean, I think your business can be whatever you want it to be, as great as you want it to be, but you have to put in the effort. It's not for free, and it does take work. My favorite quote is, if you want to be a successful business owner, you only have to work half a day. You just have to pick the 12 hours you want to work.
I love it. It's interesting. I was speaking to Dr. Amanda C. the other day, and she's also a practice owner. And I was like, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently? And she said the same thing. I would invest in practice management and leadership because it is a business first. So that seems to be the common thread amongst people who, have purchased practices, own practices for a couple of years, because it really is about leading a team and building something.
There's a great book. It's called Titans of Dentistry. It's not a plug for them, but it's an interesting book because all they do is just interview people. Everyone gets asked the exact same questions. And it starts off with the quote, everyone who's successful is successful for the exact same reasons. But the people who struggle for very different reasons. And looking back, I've been in dental almost 2 decades. It's absolutely true. The people who struggle, they're all over the place. But the people who do well, they all have cultivated this mindset of, I'm going to grow. I'm going to figure this out, that I'm capable of doing this and I'm capable of moving forward and learning and figuring it out. And to be clear, that doesn't mean they don't have setbacks. They just deal with it differently. That's all it really is. And there's so many stories out there that if you talk to your colleagues, like that are super successful, and you'll learn their backstories and you'll be like, wow, you went through that? That's amazing. You had asked me originally, what's a good piece of advice that I've gotten financially? And I told you that. I'll tell you a good piece of advice for dentists is, I think, reach out to your colleagues. Everyone wants to help you. No one wants to see you fail, right? And truthfully, if someone looks at you like you're their competition, they're probably not a good person to rely on. You want someone that doesn't care. Like all my friends that are dentists, they all talk to each other. They could be in the same building and everyone does great. They don't look at each other that way.
It's definitely building community. And I think that's a purpose for me. That's why I'm doing the podcast, is to build community, share knowledge, share information, because I think it's the only way to grow. Yeah. So no, I appreciate that. Now, my last question for you.
Sure.
What is the worst piece of financial advice you've ever received?
I'll say almost every time someone's given me a stock tip or something, I just don't take it. That's probably it. It's funny. I feel like people always have weird investment advice. Like I've had people come to me and say, hey, you should buy this natural gas whatever, or you should buy storage units with me, I would say anyone who has an investment tip is probably not where you want to be. But I would, just in general, that's probably the worst piece of financial advice is, you should have invested in storage units or some weird one-off, whatever it is, natural gas reserves, stuff like that. Yeah.
So Stephen, thanks so much for being on Teeth Matter. If someone wanted to reach out to you, how can they contact you?
Follow me on IG. I would say, I'm not an influencer by any means, but I'm usually pretty active on there. You can reach out to me. I'm super accessible. Whatever I can help you guys out with, whether you have questions about starting up. And to be clear, I'm not necessarily an expert in all of this. I have all my friends are dentists. I would say, I could tell you who to talk to. I'll point you in the right direction. Like whether it's to talk to one of my friends or someone like Dr. Armandus, see someone like that, reach out to me. And again, we're a community. We're just here to help each other. I mean, I think that's probably the most important takeaway is like, just reach out to your peers, even if it's me or you or someone else, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stephen. I really appreciate, you sharing your information, your expertise. And I know you say you might not have all the answers, but you have more answers than I do. You can answer some questions for me, and just being so open and honest is truly appreciative. So thank you.
Absolutely. Dentistry's tough. Going day to day. We're all kind of siloed, right? You guys are going to be off for 8 hours, 10 hours a day. And then you go home and then your brain's melted and you just want to watch Netflix. It's not easy, but reach out to your peers, reach out to your friends, talk to them consistently, and just, like I tell them, you don't have to do this alone. There's enough people who want you to succeed out here. There's so many of us who want you to succeed. That's it.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow our podcast, write a review, leave a comment. Anything you share with us goes a long way. And if you think a friend will appreciate this podcast, then make sure you share it with them too. Until next time, cheers.